Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're looking today at this really intense snapshot in time, October 7th and 8th, 2025. And when you look at the sources, the headlines, what jumps out is this kind of paradox of American power under President Trump.
Yeah, it really does.
So our mission today is to, well, unpack that. We want to pull out the main threads driving things during those 2 days. You got this intense geopolitical stuff happening, but at the same time, total paralysis back home in the U.S., and then some, frankly, weird consumer news thrown in. It's quite a mix.
It is. It's a fascinating period. You see the U.S. government, fundamentally struggling with its own budget, leading to a shutdown. But at the same exact moment, the president is deeply involved in trying to broker peace overseas.
Right. A real study in contrast.
And all this is happening against the backdrop of the second anniversary of that huge conflict in the Middle East. So a lot going on.
Okay, let's start with that domestic paralysis then. The U.S. government shut down. By October 7th and 8th, it was, day 7, day 8, still no budget deal between Republicans and Democrats.
That's right, dragging on.
And this isn't just, political theater in D.C. This has real costs.
Yeah.
Let's unpack this. What were the actual impacts hitting people?
Well, the costs were huge, and frankly, they were becoming part of the strategy. We're talking about roughly 750,000 federal workers furloughed, just sent home.
Wow.
And that translates to something like $400 million in unpaid wages every single day, taken right out of the economy.
And you said part of the strategy. How so?
Well, the White House, under President Trump, made a point of saying that back pay for these furloughed workers wasn't guaranteed. It wasn't automatic. It would depend on Congress approving it later.
Ah, okay. So that puts immense pressure on the Democrats, right?
Exactly. It's basically saying the longer you hold out, the more these people risk losing their pay permanently. It turns economic hardship into, well, political leverage.
So beyond the workers themselves, what about the services people rely on? How is the shutdown hitting day-to-day operations?
Yeah, the operational impact was definitely mounting. I mean, essential things like Social Security checks, Medicare payments, they continued. You can't just stop those coals.
Right.
But the administration, the support systems behind them, they started to really struggle. Think about verifying new Medicare enrollments or processing appeals or even just basic auditing. Huge backlogs building up.
So the system was sort of grinding down.
Exactly, gummed up. And then you had the more visible stuff, delays, cancellations at airports because of air traffic controller shortages, national parks, museums closed. If you needed a passport or maybe a federal loan approved, lots of uncertainty, delays.
Okay, so Washington's gridlocked over money.
Huh?
But then President Trump adds this whole other layer of controversy.
Right.
The sources mentioned him threatening to use the Insurrection Act to send troops into cities like Portland, Chicago.
Yeah, that was a huge flashpoint. The Insurrection Act, that allows the president to use active duty military or federalized National Guard for domestic law enforcement.
Which is usually reserved for, extreme situations.
Exactly. Very extreme. So just the threat of using it stirred up this massive legal and political storm. It highlights this contrast again. An executive branch that can't fund basic government functions, yet is talking about deploying military force domestically.
That contrast is really the core here, isn't it?
Yeah.
Failing to fund the government, but simultaneously projecting power both at home and, as we'll see, abroad.
Precisely.
Let's pivot then to the global stage. Because while Washington was tied in knots, President Trump was very actively engaged elsewhere. October 7th, 2025, also marked the second anniversary of that devastating Hamas attack on Israel back in 2023. 1,200 killed, 250 hostages taken. Where did things stand 2 years later on October 8th? This is where it gets really interesting.
Well, the conflict was tragically far from over. The scale, according to these sources, was just immense. Reports indicated over 67,000 Palestinian deaths in Gaza since the start of the war.
67,000.
Yeah. And Israeli military operations were still intense, ongoing, particularly targeting areas around Gaza City, the eastern suburbs. And this was still causing huge numbers of civilians to be displaced, even 2 years in.
The conflict's still very much raging.
Absolutely. Peak intensity, you could say.
But despite that, there were actual negotiations happening.
Yes, that's correct. Ceasefire talks were underway, specifically in Sharm el-Sheikh, in Egypt.
Okay, hosted by Egypt. And the U.S. role.
This is key. The basis for these negotiations was a peace proposal, and that proposal was explicitly endorsed by President Donald Trump.
So there's the paradox again. The president overseeing a government shutdown, threatening military action at home, but also the primary sponsor, essentially, of a major peace initiative in the Middle East.
Exactly that contradiction.
What was the main hurdle in those Sharm el-Sheikh talks, even with that high-level U.S. backing?
The core issue, the real sticking point, seemed to be about the sequence and conditions. Hamas indicated they were willing to release the remaining hostages. That was on the table. But the condition was a complete Israeli withdrawal from Gaza first, and the establishment of what they called proper conditions on the ground.
So hostages released after withdrawal and stabilization.
That seemed to be the Hamas position. And Israel's position, presumably, was different. That gap, hostages first versus withdrawal first, was the central difficulty. It meant the whole thing, even with Trump's endorsement, was incredibly fragile.
And this wasn't happening in a vacuum. There was significant international pressure surrounding the conflict, right?
Oh, absolutely. The sources mention specific international condemnation, particularly concerning strikes near hospitals or areas where journalists were known to be operating.
Right.
And adding to that, the UN Security Council was actually meeting right around this time to discuss Israel's plans to expand its operations in Gaza City. So, yeah, a lot of diplomatic friction, a lot of international concern about how the war was being fought, even as these peace talks were supposedly progressing.
Okay, so we've got the domestic shutdown crisis, the high-stakes international conflict and diplomacy. What else was vying for attention during these 2 days? Sometimes the other headlines really provide surprising context.
They really do. The world definitely keeps spinning, often in really different directions at once. For instance, completely separate from all this, you had a potentially historic moment in Japanese politics.
Oh.
Yeah, the ruling party elected Sanai Takaichi, poised to become Japan's first female prime minister. A huge development there.
Wow. Okay. A major political shift happening quietly in the background, for us at least.
Exactly. And then, related to the Gaza conflict but happening elsewhere, you saw its ripples. British police were granted expanded powers to handle pro-Palestinian protests in London, showing the tensions in Europe.
Right.
And there was also news involving the Swedish activist Greta Thunberg. She was making allegations of torture during detention in Israel, apparently related to her involvement in Gaza flotilla protests.
So the conflict's impact, politically and socially, was definitely global.
No question.
But the contrast, I find, maybe the most jarring, is the economic one. While 750,000 federal workers are wondering about their paychecks because of the shutdown, what's happening in the world of shopping.
Yeah, that juxtaposition is really something. The sources confirm, right during this period, major retail events like Amazon Prime, Big Deal Days were in full swing.
Seriously, Prime Day during a government shutdown and a major war anniversary.
Well, Big Deal Days, their autumn event, but yes, offering huge discounts, kicking off the holiday shopping season. So while the Trump administration is, in this budget standoff affecting hundreds of thousands of workers, a significant portion of the public is focused on finding deals, optimizing their holiday spending, clicking refresh.
It really highlights how disconnected these major political and international crises can sometimes feel from the kind of immediate consumer reality for many people.
It really does. And alongside that, life's other major events just continued. There was a massive verdict in the Johnson & Johnson cancer lawsuit, nearly $1 billion, $966 million ordered in payment.
Huge legal news.
And just sheer tragedy, too. Environmental disasters, deadly landslides, floods, even a lightning strike in Nepal killing over 22 people. It's a reminder that everything else, law, life, death, commerce, health, it doesn't pause just because politicians are arguing over a budget. So if we try to pull it all together, recap that central tension we've been talking about, you've got the U.S. system on one hand looking paralyzed, this major internal budget fight causing a functional crisis in government services. But on the other hand, the U.S. president, President Trump, is acting as this key global player sponsoring a major peace effort in Egypt.
Yeah, this deep dive into just 2 days, October 7th and 8th, 2025, really gives you this picture of the U.S. as, well, simultaneously broken at home and indispensable abroad. Defining international diplomacy even while its own government functions were sputtering, partly as a deliberate political tactic.
And that leads us to, I think, the final thought we wanted to leave you with, a question to consider. How does that visible internal crisis, the shutdown, the political weaponization of worker pay, this dysfunction manufactured in part by the White House itself, how does that affect America's credibility, its leverage, when it's trying to broker these incredibly delicate peace deals overseas like the one President Trump was endorsing in Egypt?
Does the world look at the internal chaos and take the external efforts less seriously? Or are they seen as separate arenas?
Exactly, because the world is definitely watching both. Its internal failures are just as visible as its diplomatic ambitions. Something to think about.